Hi there, and welcome to Shapers, Makers, Builders, and Breakers. I'm your host today, Benjamin Shaw. Shapers is the podcast show that brings you African leadership stories in all spheres of society, where we interview exceptional individuals telling us their story.
This podcast is brought to you by Exeo Capital. Exeo Capital is a leading alternative private equity fund manager that through its 15-year history have focused on investing in African businesses with purpose and impact. Exeo covers the whole of the African continent with investment teams based in Cape Town, South Africa and Nairobi, Kenya, currently managing investments in 9 African countries. The core investment thesis revolves around partnering with exceptional businesses and their teams that have the ability to impact Africa in the decades to come. Exeo does this through providing growth capital to these businesses, but more than that, leveraging a partnership ethos with the companies they invest in. For more information, please have a look at their website, www.exeocapital.com. That is www.exeocapital.com. We hope that you will enjoy today's conversation as much as we enjoyed recording it. Without any further delay, let's dive into our next episode of Shapers, Makers, Builders, and Breakers.
Imagine your daily life as a giant adventure game. Instead of just ticking off boring to-dos, you're embarking on quests. Each task is a mission, every small win earns you points, and every challenge conquered levels you up as a person. Well, gamification is the art of turning these everyday experiences into some form of immersive game, where you can combine motivation and fun and replace drudgery and distraction. And Japie Greeff, the guest today, is here to discuss this as one of the most powerful trends of our time. Here on the pod, welcome. Thanks for joining us, Japie.
Thanks a lot, Benjamin.
Before we begin our own, quest together, why don't you just introduce yourself, give a bit of your background and why and where gamification fits into your story.
Okay, so I'm Professor Japie Greeff. I'm the research coordinator for Belgian campus ITversity. I'm also an extraordinary professor at the Northwest University. Where I used to be the sort of deputy director for computer science and information systems there. My formal training is as an engineer, first and foremost, but obviously branched out into software throughout the course of my career, and really that's where kind of gamification came into the thing. So my initial studies were predominantly electronics, manufacturing focused. Mm-hmm. And I finished my master's in the sort of high-speed manufacturing side of things, then moved out into the software industry. And when I sort of really got into the gamification thing, it was more from an industry perspective. So we were doing small projects with various organizations. So we did a lot of conferences that we gamified. And this was at Dimension Data before it got bought out by NTT. Mm. And really, it really captured my imagination at the time. And then when I wanted to start a PhD, I initially looked at the engineering side of things and then found a supervisor, Prof. Rulin Heyman, at the University of Johannesburg, that was really open-minded. And she pitched this idea that, students were having some problems. And I told her about gamification. And then she said, that sounds amazing. And we kind of did the journey together, yeah.
Amazing. Before we talk gamification then, you've painted an outline of your kind of academic journey, but the role of extraordinary professor and then lecturer also we should double click on. What do you teach and train and how is that kind of, maybe not linked, but how does that flow through to what you've learned in that journey?
So I do a lot of things at the moment. I think I'm spread across quite a number of places. So from a teaching perspective, I predominantly taught artificial intelligence. But most
good place to be.
Yeah, a fun place to be at the moment. Yeah. It really is an exciting time to be a researcher in artificial intelligence. It's also where a fair amount of my research has been.
Okay.
And then predominantly I work with postgraduate students, so, masters and PhD students. Mm-hmm. My first PhD student was absolutely in game development, specifically serious game development. Mm-hmm. Lance Bunt, he's a brilliant researcher, I think has surpassed me in many ways, at least from a game perspective. He's really brilliant. Some of my other students have been also gamification and serious games based, but then also maybe more traditional artificial intelligence stuff has pitched up quite a lot.
We don't often have academics on our show, so perhaps you could just before you continue to give us your involvement, just explain a little bit about what it means to oversee a project, what that looks like, what sort of research is developed, and maybe when you say you've supervised a project, what would a typical project be for a postgrad?
So if you think about the journey, I mean, so basically in the South African context, if you think about our national qualifications framework, you go after school from NQF 4 all the way up to NQF 10. So NQF 4, 5, and 6, or 4, 6, and 7 would be your undergraduate qualifications, in which case, most qualifications you would end up with some sort of a capstone project at the end of third year. And that really is the point where you would enter industry.
So that's your graduates from university or from higher ed?
That's basically when you finish. Then you've got the option of doing honors, which is your NQF 8 or fourth year. So if you're doing an engineering degree, that would form part of your professional bachelor's degree. Mm-hmm. If you're doing something like computer science, you would do an honors. And part of your fourth year in South Africa is always going to be some sort of a research project. Now, all of the projects you've done up until that point would be very scripted. So there's a very well-defined kind of beginning, middle, and end. There's an outline.
University.
Absolutely. Whereas a research project is a little bit more open-ended. So now you're kind of entering into a field or entering into some sort of a problem where you don't know the answer up front. So you're trying to, establish something as a fact that you don't know is a fact. So you may want to find it from a literature study. So that would be, a theoretical goal that you have in your study. So the answer exists, but you need to go find it. Mm-hmm. Or it could be something more empirical, which is done through, some sort of a practical experiment, or, design science is a methodology that I'm very, very much focused on. Yeah. And ultimately in your fourth year, in your honors, you're basically just covering the idea of research. So really it's still quite focused on industry, but the research component is there.
So you get through graduates or through to graduation. If anyone has studied that far, they know that they're doing some form of research projects, but they're not.
But it's small. It's really small at the honors level.
They're not contributing to new research. They're
exactly
unearthing things that are mostly tested.
Exactly.
From that point, which is where you focus.
Then you get to the master's level.
Okay.
And now the focus shifts slightly.
Right.
So there's actually only one thing that you need to achieve, but preferably two things. So the main thing you want to achieve with a master's is being the master of research methodology. So even if you're replicating something that has been done before, you need to show that you can go through the master's process.
That rigorous.
Yes, very rigorous. Right. You need to have falsifiability. You need to be able to show that you can dive into the literature and really upskill yourself in a new field. Mm-hmm. You need to be able to write appropriately and really convey your thoughts.
Is that predominantly an academic pursuit, or is that often tethered to industry?
So it's interesting you bring that up, because in my current role, I would say very much tethered to industry. In my previous role, not so much. Okay. I think this is maybe one of the differences between your private institutions versus public institutions, because the expectation for masters is not at all that it would be tethered to industry. It's really in an academic institution.
Because the incentive is publication.
Absolutely. So, you need to prove that you are capable of being a researcher, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to develop something that is useful necessarily in an application. In an application.
So it's useful.
So it's useful.
It contributes to the body of knowledge.
Absolutely.
Not practically applicable necessarily.
Okay. So, if you think about Claude Shannon, I think it was Shannon, I may be wrong, his master's thesis dissertation was considered one of the most important contributions to knowledge ever, where he took Boolean algebra and the whole concept of logic, and in his master's proved that you could apply that with electronic relays. And that really started the concept of what a computer is now.
Right.
That was a research project.
Right.
It didn't necessarily at that point in time contribute to any kind of industry, but it birthed an entire industry.
I mean, I just want to take the opportunity to segue there. So that is, I guess, what excited me about having this conversation, that we've got another industry in computers general that is continually birthing new ideas from various fields. We'll talk a bit about gamification, which is your thesis, but you've mentioned AI. That's another research project in a lab somewhere once that has now been applied in a completely different framework and is it's generating the results that we know are taking the world.
Absolutely. And again, I mean, you think about artificial intelligence, it's huge in the narrative. I mean, we're talking about AI all the time. But the whole idea of artificial intelligence really started with the Dartmouth conference. And that was a bunch of academics that came together at Dartmouth in 1956, if I'm correct. And they really just mapped out and they said, we think that computers can think. And these are the fields that we'll explore doing this. And a number of things that, even now we are still exploring came up in that period already. So a lot of the concepts of, playing games against machines. So maybe touching a little bit on the gameful side of things, but, trying to teach a computer to beat someone at chess was an academic project for a decade.
Yeah.
And it led to so many things, related to pathfinding. And I mean, the whole idea of how Google Maps works right now would never have been a thing if we didn't spend decades working out how to beat people at chess, because the pathfinding that you would do on a board translates incredibly well to
all the
roads
applications of industry.
So that is really what you're trying to capture in a research project. It may not necessarily be applicable right now, but in some way it could be applicable later. Whereas at the honors level, you're very much trying to do something that is very much applicable.
So your research. So you're now in the postgrad and supervisory role. But before you tell me about that, your research went into gamification. Was that your master's or your doctorate?
PhD. Yeah, PhD. That was my PhD.
Which is now NQF.
That's NQF 10. Yeah. So that's basically as high as you can go.
Right.
And really there. The assumption is that you're already a researcher because you did a master's. Now, the only requirement for a PhD is that you must contribute to human knowledge. So with a master's, it's not necessarily required. It would be great if it is. So if you can get a journal publication out of a master's, that's brilliant. But it's not necessarily a requirement to pass a master's. But for a PhD, it is. So you need to be able to show that the work you've done, at least some component of it, has never been done by anyone before. You've learned something new, you've proven something new, or whatever the case may be. But that's really the contribution side of things.
Okay, well that makes a lot of sense, and it's also a great introduction to be able to say this is who I'm interviewing, someone who's contributed to the knowledge of humanity in gaming, and more than that, having read I won't say 100%, but a substantial part of your paper. Maybe tell us a bit about that. So your role now is in academic supervisory, but also in industry. You said you're in a private institution.
Yeah.
How does that link to what you sort of built out as a thesis? And then let's dive into that thesis itself.
Yeah. So that's why I was saying in terms of my role now, I think it would be slightly different, because I do think there is a slight difference in the focus of private institutions versus public institutions. Public institutions get a huge amount of funding for publications. I mean, it's a heavily subsidized system, because the idea is tax money will pay for research that is used for the public good.
Right.
That's the whole principle. In private institutions, however, you don't benefit from that at all. So there's no incentive from government for private institutions to do research.
It's an R&D function.
Yeah. So that means that for a private institution, it needs to show value to its stakeholders. And in our instance, our stakeholders are predominantly industry. So, the students that we graduate, they need to go into industry positions or become entrepreneurs. There's really, from an educational perspective, there's sort of 6 places that someone can go after a degree. If you think about it, and really only 6. So they can either graduate and get a job, so they can go into employment. They can go into entrepreneurship, so graduate and start their own thing. They can graduate and go to further study, so postgraduate work. They can be unemployed, which is what we want to avoid. They can be unemployed, but by choice, so become like a homemaker, get married, or whatever the case may be. Or, they can effectively change their degree. So they're not unemployed, they're just in a new direction at that point. And that's really it. There's not a lot of other pathways that someone can do. So for us, we need to focus on the top 3. So basically, we want to ensure that you're employable. We want to ensure that you've got the knowledge that you could create some sort of business with, or, upgrade your qualifications by studying further. But from a private institution perspective, the focus is really on that first one, where we want to say, okay, well, the graduates that we create, yes, they've got critical thinking skills. Yes, they've got all of the theoretical knowledge, but we want them to be as economically viable as possible. And that's where the master's conversation sometimes gets a bit fuzzy, because if you finished an honors degree, should be very applicable to industry. But then if you do 2 years of a master's and it's very conceptual, very theoretical, and you kind of let your technical skills degrade a little bit over time, you've gained the knowledge of what it is to do research, but there's not a lot of companies that want to pay you to do research. That's generally an academic function. So you become slightly less employable if you go that route. Whereas if you do a master's that's maybe more professional in context or in concept, so, you do something in partnership with an industry,
or into an industry body, or
some sort of an internship, or, that makes you a master of the field that you're in. And that was the second part of the equation that I wanted to say earlier, is that the formal requirement for a master's is that you be a master of research methodology. At our institution, the idea is that you would be a master of your domain as well. So you would do some sort of a technical thing that is sufficiently advanced that you would be able to show to an industry, person that you're proficient at something.
Which makes a lot of sense, because, as you say, you're solving for the problem of employability, for impact in industry and relevance, which, as you say, it's not always academic pursuit. Now, the thesis that you wrote is highly relevant, I think, in industry, and it's on gamification enriching students' learning experiences. Maybe give us a short explanation of why you find or why you think that's an important contribution to how society views games in particular.
So, I think maybe there's a question of gamification versus games.
Right.
Because there is
let's define. Yeah.
So, and in fact, games are actually incredibly difficult to define. That is philosophically, that's a very difficult thing. Gamification, however, is the use of game elements in a non-game context. So you would use things like points, badges, leaderboards, streaks, the kinds of things that you would experience in games, but in some sort of a system or environment where you wouldn't expect to see them. So if you look at things like, I think what people experience a lot of things like the Discovery,
loyalty
programs,
leaderboards.
Absolutely, leaderboards. Duolingo, if you've ever wanted to study another language, huge gamification happening there. So for me, gamification was sort of the vehicle to try and solve the problem of motivation.
Okay.
Because, where the context that I did my PhD in was at the University of Johannesburg, looking at the final year students in engineering. So I was also supervising at the time for that department for, fourth year students. And there was really a lack of motivation as students go through the process, because it's stressful. Doing an engineering degree is not a trivial thing. I definitely respect students who go through it. I think in many ways my path was a lot easier than other students, because I did all of my studies part-time. So I always had, industry people helping me. Whenever I got stuck, I could ask someone, very, very easily. But if you're going down the road of studying it full-time, it's a challenge.
Okay.
And on top of that, as I said earlier, your final year project is the first time you're going to experience something that is very open-ended. So you don't know. And one of the things that's important in research, and it's difficult to publish, admittedly, but it's important to be able to fail. So if you try something and you don't succeed, that was still research. The answer to your questioning could be no.
Right.
And students sometimes struggle with that, when they make the transition between the sort of undergraduate experience and maybe the more research experience.
So the applicability at the time of your thesis was for the students who are going through a learning curve. But the way I read what you'd written, that applicability should be far beyond a fourth-year student, because we're all learning all the time and we all have skill curves that we need to climb as our careers progress or as our opportunities exist.
Absolutely.
Is that a fair application?
Absolutely. And I mean, gamification flies. There is a lot of implementations of gamification in the educational space, but it's not just applicable in the education and training space. There's a lot of spaces. And in fact, even from a sort of personal wellness point of view, you could gamify your own life. And there are platforms that absolutely do that.
You're seeing it even in areas that are sort of not traditionally tech focused, or not traditionally video game linked. Places like gyms, memberships for health and fitness platforms, wellness schedules, nutritionists having leaderboards in their office.
For sure.
So we're definitely seeing it come across. What is it from your research that you found that makes games or game mechanics so suitable for motivation?
So, and in fact, the whole kind of study of motivation is a field in and of itself. There's quite a famous theory called self-determination theory that really tries to explore what creates intrinsic motivation. Because, from a motivation point of view, there is a difference between extrinsic and intrinsic motivation.
And gamification focuses on?
Intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic, but with elements of extrinsic.
Depending on the reward.
Depending on the reward, exactly. So you see from the research that extrinsic motivation tends to not necessarily be a viable thing long term. So if you can think about it from a practical point of view, if you really hate your job, but it pays well, you're not going to feel very motivated. Money alone doesn't necessarily drive you to do better. You will stick it out because you need a salary, but it's not necessarily going to make you feel, fully engaged and happy and motivated.
Right.
Now, for intrinsic motivation, there are different sort of sub-theories around it. The one I really like is called RAMP, and it's by Pink, is the researcher that put it forward, based on the original kind of concepts that Ryan and Decky put forward in self-determination theory. They started with three concepts, which are relatedness, autonomy, and mastery.
Okay, so that's RAM.
Yeah, RAM, and Pink added purpose.
Okay, so say those again.
So relatedness, autonomy, and mastery, and purpose. So basically, you need to feel like your choices matter. So the stuff you do needs to impact whatever it is you're working on. You've got autonomy in the process. You need to feel like you can actually get better at it. So you getting better day by day is a really motivating thing, and that leads to mastery. There needs to be some sort of relatedness or community. So the fact that you're getting better at this thing, you should have other people that you can talk to who would recognize that and say, wow, you're doing really well. And then the purpose thing is something bigger than just yourself. And I really do like the idea of adding purpose. I think it's a good addition. And really that, so not just from a gamification point of view, if you could grab those four things, you really can get people more motivated. And that is one of the things that I really tried to bring in with the way I designed the system for the University of Johannesburg. There were a lot of questions that came up initially from the discussion with my supervisor about what students felt was holding them back. And for example, one of the things of holding them back was their choices of projects. They didn't feel like they really had a choice of what they would.
So which of the ramp items would that have been?
Autonomy.
Yeah.
Right. So yes, you need to be able to follow instructions, But if you're doing research, it really helps if you can actually have, something that you find interesting and that you've got a choice in. Mastery kind of comes through the process of doing supervision. So that was something that I think it should come across in your studies. So you should be better at the project you were doing at the end of the year than you were at the beginning of the year. So you should have learned. Relatedness was something that we also spent quite a bit of time on. So really sharing information between students. So not just, between them and their supervisor, but really having kind of project days and, places where you could.
Communal sharing and absolute visibility and transparency across.
Yeah. And then purpose is a difficult one, but really trying to bring that into the study to say, okay, well, why are you doing this? It's not just for the sake of getting a degree. You should have some sort of an idea of what you're trying to achieve at the end of the day.
Right.
And it didn't work for all students, admittedly, but for the ones that it did work, it worked brilliantly.
Well, I mean, that's a fantastic case study for it. And as I said, I think applicability is even beyond the student game. But maybe let's just take a segue here to talk more broadly about how this gamification has become part of our vernacular. We now talk about, people leveling up at work or
absolutely,
they're on their own quest, they're on their own side mission. One of my favorite quotes I read last year is that Snoop Dogg has completed more side missions than any other human in history.
Yeah.
And of course, you hear it and you know exactly what people mean because it's so part of our discourse. But in 2012, and I know that you're also a big fan, Jane McGonigal wrote her book, her seminal book, I would say, Reality is Broken. And that was on the back of her PhD, which, as far as I know, was one of the first sort of specific... out of, I think it was Berkeley, or was it UCAL, her thesis? I can't recall.
I can't remember.
But in any case, gameful thinking was her sort of big contribution. And that really is, it sounds like a concept you built on. So for anyone who hasn't read it or isn't familiar with it, her hypothesis, and I know less than you, so you can correct me, but as I recall, she speaks of the fact that game design so perfectly encapsulates things for people to enjoy that it changes work to play. And we do it really well particularly in video games, but in gameful settings, that we should incorporate it more into reality. And that was the book, reality is not doing it, so we're not doing well enough, it's broken. Do you, in now trying to incorporate some of those mechanics into the reality of people studying, did you find those concepts applied? Did you learn anything different to what she presented, and how you kind of relate to that statement?
I definitely, as you say, I found her work very, very influential on mine. She's maybe not the first person to talk about gamification. So people like Yukai Chao was doing it, I think, quite a bit earlier.
Right.
I think Cup was also doing it quite a bit earlier. The whole, what we now call serious games, edutainment.
Let's define that. So what is a serious game?
So, and maybe we should go back to the idea of a game, right? Because it's something that I ended up writing a fair bit about because it is just so interesting, is that there's not really a universally accepted definition of what a game is, because for every definition people put forward, there are examples that don't fit that. So, if one of the definitions that I really do like, and maybe it ties into what you were saying earlier, is that a game is the voluntary overcoming of obstacles with our purpose. So if you think of something like golf, let me restate it. It's the voluntary overcoming of unnecessary obstacles. Okay. So if you think of something like golf, the goal is to put the ball in the hole. That's what you're trying to achieve. But you're trying to achieve it in the least efficient way possible. Because you could just pick it up. It could be really, really easy. Right. But you're using this little tiny stick and
constrained as possible voluntarily.
Absolutely. Right. So, what McGonigal put forward was that, in games, we put these restrictions on ourselves. We accept them. Yeah. And we have fun by going through the process. And really life is exactly the same. There's so many things that you have to do that you don't necessarily want to do. So it's got all the characteristics of a game, but because you don't have points and badges and things that, and make it
progression.
gainful.
I think, So gainful, just interject, I think one of the things that made such a mark on me reading it, this is many years ago, was that gamification is around us, but because we don't acknowledge progression, it's hard to have that feedback make you feel good about it.
Absolutely.
Unlike a sport or a game.
For sure. And in fact, her second book, so she wrote another book called Super Better, which is also a really, really great book. And in that, she actually built a system, basically a website at the time, that really tries to make life like a game. So you would take, something big that you have to achieve that is, really freaking you out, and you would make that your main quest. But then you would also have, smaller quests that build up to it. You've got, daily things that you need to do, weekly things that you need to do, and really kind of make this journey similar to what you would in a game. And
it just sounds so much more fun than project management, but it's the same thing.
So something that I think kind of spun off from Super Better is a system called Habitica, and one that I've actually found quite a bit of value with some of my students. Also completely free. It's an open source tool, but basically with that, you have a little avatar. So as you would imagine a role-playing game or something like that, that has a weapon, a shield, it's got a pet, it's got an armor that you can upgrade, and you have a currency that you would try and earn. And the way you effectively play the game and upgrade this avatar is by doing daily tasks, by doing weekly tasks, by doing
building habits.
Main thing, literally trying to build habits. And every time you miss a habit, you take damage. Every time you fulfill all your habits, you get resources. And there's a huge community of people that build sort of quest packs. So if you're having trouble, keeping your house clean, there's a quest pack for that to say, well, every day you need to make sure you wash the dishes. And when you do, you'll get some experience points for doing that. And then you can build, little teams that you kind of share your avatars between amongst each other. You can take on the same kinds of quests and really share your experiences around that. I find it to be an incredible system for something that's free. It's really, really,
it's really great. What's interesting about that, of course, is the generation ahead of us would find it absolutely bizarre that we would need these sorts of layers of reality between us completing a task and us feeling good about it. And so it's perhaps unfairly categorized as escapism. Games are just, you're avoiding reality.
For sure.
Whereas McGonagall and Three Off Thesis as well, you're proposing ways to integrate the two, to actually not separate them, but actually bring them together. That specifically, could you tell us why that's important? Why should a business leader or an executive listening to this consider gamification as part of their day job?
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that I realized through my my work and maybe just some of my students' work after me is there are limits to gamification. So I think that the nature of the game industry has changed how we perceive gamification from a content perspective. And by let me explain what I mean by that. If you're playing a game that doesn't constantly give you new content, it becomes boring really quickly. Whereas maybe 30 years ago, people were not used to games that had massive amounts of content constantly being written to your face. And I think that has changed things a little bit. So gamification is effective, but not necessarily for the long term, on the same thing. So if you're trying to build up a habit for, washing your dishes, your goal should be to try and build that habit, because the gamification is not necessarily going to take it there for the next 30 years. Right.
So the motivation to sort of initiate rather than to sustain is more proven. Okay.
But if I may use an example from one of my industry partners, Boiler Room, they've built an HR training system that is absolutely like a role-playing game. So you would play through different lands of the organization. Different forms will be introduced to you as the end result of quests that you've done. You would run through a full story with your fellow staff members. It is an incredibly effective way of training people up in the policies of the organization.
Right.
And that's not necessarily something that you would have to do every day forever. It's a very short-term intervention, and it really, really shows it is very effective.
So would you consider that as a new mode of delivery?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, that's very interesting.
So again, that's maybe almost touching more on a serious game. So when we said earlier, games are hard to define, the definition that seems to have everyone agreeing with it is the idea of the magic circle. So it's basically saying that if you are playing a game, it's like being in a magic circle. You know what the confines of that game are. Someone who's standing outside can recognize that you're playing the game and that they are outside of the game. And that's pretty much it. So it doesn't specify that there should be a winner or a loser or a start or end. It does capture kind of everyone. So that sort of system that is very narrative based, I think, is maybe touching more on what's called a serious game, which is a game that has as its purpose not just fun. So entertainment is not the only function of the game. There's some sort of training or information that it's trying to give you.
And I think it's worth just emphasizing that point. I think games and gamification, in some ways it's unfortunate the words are so similar, but of course it's derivative. So when we talk gamification and in the reading that you've done much more than I have, that gamification as a concept is a set of mechanics to drive outcomes. Games happen to have been where it's piloted, tested, perfected, but those mechanics are serious. I mean, they're genuine leverage points for human development, for progress, for teamwork, for any range of skill. I want to touch on a comment you made on content. So if we accept that content is what keeps the game fresh, and I'm not going to say it does or doesn't, but let's say that it does, would AI not solve that constraint? And particularly generative AI, as we said in our pod a couple of times, we're in a world that's changing so quickly that it's almost irrelevant what we say about AI a month ago, because it will have changed in 6 months. However, generative AI as a concept is here to stay, and that is theoretically the ability to generate content ad nauseum. How would that impact your thinking in keeping games and game mechanics fresh?
Absolutely. And I mean, it is something that some of my postgraduate students are absolutely looking on, virtually, using generative AI to create massive amounts of content to make games more engaging over a longer period of time.
Right.
Another project that we actually very recently kicked off is actually looking at the opportunities that generative AI brings to parenting. So literally, I mean, if you are a stay-at-home mom and you have a fair amount of time and you're trying to help your kids with homework or whatever the case may be, generative AI can help you make game-like experience or game-full experiences very easily in ways that just weren't possible previously. And I think that is the power of AI at the moment, is that maybe even 5 years ago, AI was in the domain of the experts.
Right.
It was only people with hectic qualifications that could use it. Whereas now, I think it's open to pretty much everyone, and it is multimodal. So I mean, you can create images, you can create music, you can create text.
Actually, now that you say that, 2 weeks ago, I met with a business leader who's helping his daughter through homework by taking pictures of her textbook every week, and on the Friday, or I don't know what day it is, one day a week, he will then ask, he'll prompt, I think it's ChatGPT, to create a quiz, and it will continue to ask questions in the format of the quiz based on those pages that he's taking pictures of until she receives 80%. And I mean, what a great use of a free tool, which is
for sure
much more fun.
And there are so many. Actually, one of my students that just finished quite recently, Diamond, he did a sort of virtual reality, or not virtual, 3-dimensional game, teaching students on information theory, which is a sort of advanced topic in engineering. And he used something called Bayesian knowledge tracing, which is something that I think has quite a lot of potential to help. And really, it just...
You'll have to define that.
So in simple terms, it's a way of asking the right number of questions to the student. So basically, if you are asked a question and you answer it correct the first time, you may want to repeat it once more, but chances are you know what's going on. If you get it wrong, you would have to ask it more than once.
Right.
But now the question is, did you answer it correctly the second time by guessing, or did you actually grasp the concept? And Bayesian knowledge tracing tries to work out at what point has the student actually grasped the information. So he used that to basically repeat some of the questions in the game until students actually reach a level of mastery. It is a well-known technique, but I think we're going to see more of that sort of thing emerging in the kind of format that parents and educators can use really easily.
So I buy that, and I think parents and educators are good use cases because they're pretty relatable to everyone.
Yeah.
Now let's ask a harder question. Where do you see these mechanics coming into industry outside of academic pursuit?
So there's a couple of really interesting use cases.
And you did mention HR actually.
HR is an excellent one,
and that's training and I guess professional development going forward.
For sure.
Right.
I think especially things like policies that change but not so frequently, I think are an excellent use case. If you've got a really big task that you have a large team working on that requires fairly simple operations, but a lot of them. That is a great use case for gamification. Microsoft used it when they were transitioning between, I think it was quite a while ago. So I think it may have been Windows 8. Their internationalization team basically had this task of taking the entirety of Windows and translating it to however many languages.
Sure.
And they turned that into a game. So they basically had the number of strings you've translated as a team, right, for individuals.
That's your score, or that's your level.
That's your score. Right. And then you had different language teams competing against one another to see who could win. And yes, there would be extrinsic rewards, but it was actually that intrinsic push of having your team kind of do the best that really did drive your massive outcomes. Now, there's sort of 3 kinds of gamification. We talk about structural gamification, content gamification, and performance gamification. So structural gamification is similar to what I was saying with the HR training. That is basically,
it's a mode.
Well, maybe not even. Maybe even my work is more structural gamification. So the content doesn't change much. It is just the way you shuttle the person learning it through the process.
The mode of delivery.
The mode of delivery, effectively. Content gamification is more like that HR system where the actual HR policies are now being taught to you as part of a story. Maybe let's have a random example of, the princess that you have to go rescue will give you the information, but the princess in that specific instance is the HR practitioner and you would need to speak to her. So you're changing the content in a gameful way. Performance gamification is more like the Microsoft example I was saying. So that they've got set tasks they need to do. You're just trying to make them do more of it more efficiently. And depending on what it is you're gamifying, that can be a little bit iffy. So if you are, for example, doing, deliveries or, some sort of warehouse work, and you're trying to get people to do things much faster, you may find people trying to do it so fast that it actually becomes a little bit less safe. And that, is just something to consider.
One of the pushbacks against gamification relies on competitiveness. And so if you are not competitive, it won't work. It can't work. It will make me feel worse and better. To what degree is that true? I haven't yet found a single person who says that that's true of me, but I have found writing saying, well, it's true of a general population.
Of a population. I think it is true. I certainly
and does it
don't
nullify the effect? Because surely everyone
argue.
Yeah, everyone competes with themselves, even if not someone else.
Absolutely. And some people just don't like games.
Right.
They really just don't.
Right.
I would argue that in that instance, a gamified system is effectively as effective as writing it down on paper.
Okay. So there's no downside.
There's no benefit to it. So, if you're just not liking any of those characteristics. So if you would consider things like going to the gym, it may be a great way to encourage you, blah, blah, blah. Certain people may just think, well, this is stupid, but they're willing to do X number of reps, and
right.
The game may just tell them how to do that in an efficient way. So there are some things that I do think are a bit of a problem, and maybe this touches on games a little bit more, is basically dopamine addiction. And I mean, that's really what we experience with social media and, doom scrolling and spending a huge amount of time on, the various social media platforms that we do. You constantly getting bombarded by information, and it kind of gives you that small little kick of dopamine. And if you're constantly doing it, that's not a good thing. In my research, it's actually been a very small percentage of people that happens to.
And almost exclusively digital? Or not?
I would say yes. I think anyone that's got a very kind of compulsive, personality could experience that.
But what I'm saying is, in the case that have been reported, or the negative press, because there are articles about it, the ones I've found have all been online. There's some mechanic online in this website or this game, whatever, which has created a compulsive loop.
Absolutely.
Offline, if it's safer as far.
So I think the ones that kind of tend to make the news, if I think of the whole loot box scenario, I mean that absolutely, that was literally selling gambling to children. Because gambling is super addictive, and kids are just as open to being addicted as what adults are.
Yes,
and exploiting that.
So so not everyone will know that example.
Oh yeah. So basically, it. Online game, massively multiplayer online game, and
that children could play.
That children could play, and you could buy effectively in-game currency, and buy with that in-game currency, you could buy like lucky packets, and you would get different gear inside of that lucky packet that you could use in the game.
And some kids racked up,
thousands of dollars, of debt, using their parents' credit card, just effectively gambling to buy tons and tons of lucky packets. So that caused a huge uproar. And there's a lot of, there are ethical questions around gamification. If you are trying to exploit the kinds of behaviors that people, tend to get addicted on, that's not a good thing.
It's a good point to make, because it does balance the case. I think most of our conversation has been on the fact that there's so many incentives that can get built in. There's so much improvement in performance. There's typically, and according to your paper as well, a high proportion of people who engage with gamification that find it a more pleasant experience relative to zero, rather relative to no gamification in a process. But the other thing that I think was interesting in research that I read about is that sometimes having a gameful mindset doesn't require mechanics. It just requires your own thought process to think through the mechanics. And there was an example, I can't remember in which country, but they put up Mario boxes in real life with the symbols that you would associate with hitting a Mario box to open it. And just watch what people did. And there was no instruction, there was no anything. And if you weren't of a mindset to play Mario, you wouldn't know what to do. But there was such a high proportion of people who knew that everyone else kind of followed and learned that if you hit the box, I don't know what like a sweet came out or something. And so what I find fascinating about that is it does say that whether or not you're interested in gamification, the people who are and who are going to build out the mechanics of our incentives going forward, because that's where we're going, they're going to lead us all that path. We're all going to get there. We're going to learn from them doing it and it working. Is that congruent with your findings?
Absolutely. And I mean, I think what's fascinating about gamification is that, you can spend a huge amount of time, gamifying something and making it super complex. There are some really simple examples that have shown to be just incredibly effective. I'm trying to remember the country. I'll lie if I say it, but it was a brilliant example of a speeding lottery. So basically, they had cameras up to watch people speed. And if you drove below the speed limit, okay, your license plate would be put into a lottery. If you went above the speed limit, you would get a fine. And at the end of every month, they would have a lottery draw, and all the people who got fined, that money would go to the lottery.
Amazing.
And it dropped the amount of people speeding by a huge amount.
That is incredible.
There's both, there's a carrot and a stick.
Yeah.
So you would obviously have the fine, but now you've actually got an incentive to not speed. And it was just a really effective way of taking a game mechanic of a lottery and just deploying it across everyone. So, I think there are really great examples of things that you could do in a very simple way that would have those kinds of, if you're just thinking in a gameful way.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great society benefit. One of the other ones that has probably made the news a bit more in the last 5 years has been the health benefits of gaming. I know that there's also studies that will point out the sort of the concerns.
For sure.
But some of the health benefits that I read recently, the NIH published a study saying that children were improving cognitive skills, memory collection. It helps with stress relief, although I think it depends on which game you're playing,
for sure.
in my view. But also combating anxiety and loneliness, which I think is an increasing concern, not just of parents, but across the world. We're seeing fewer friendships being reported, an addiction to screens rather than social activities. So this element of being able to combat loneliness is I think, quite significant. How do you think gamification unlocks that in the real world? So let's now not talk about games. Let's say that you and I are going to work and we've got teams to engage with and develop relationships with. What do you think will happen in the next 5 to 10 years as more of the mechanics become normalized?
I think many of the mechanics have been normalized and are not necessarily positive. I think social media is a great example of it. People do spend too much time on social media, chasing that dopamine high and not necessarily doing something productive. So I think there are definitely negative sides to it that can happen if you employ it in an unethical way is really the thing. However, that said, there are also really positive examples. And I think some of the ones we've mentioned in terms of, I think the health loyalty programs, I think are a really great way of doing things. I think Duolingo is an excellent example of, people training or learning different skills. And I think people are comfortable enough already with gamification that you could employ it in a much broader way in different organizations. I think people just don't necessarily always understand how to frame the thing they're trying to do as a game. That's really, I think, the main thing to overcome. But there are definitely, companies in South Africa. I mentioned Boiler Room earlier as just one of the examples that I've really enjoyed the work they do. That really show you how you can do it effectively. And I think business leaders can really benefit from engaging with companies that can really take a component of the work they need doing and turning it into a gameful system that then really can get people engaged more fully in their day-to-day lives.
I think that's a great example, and I must do some research myself on Boiler Room to understand them a bit better. 2 examples that I can think of that come to mind. It's not uncommon for someone who says that they hate games to enjoy a pub quiz night, and that's a great example of a gamified. In fact, you're basically learning trivia. Why would you choose to do that? Oh, it's because I'm going to go to a quiz night. And another, in several conference breakouts, it's not uncommon to have an icebreaker, which is maybe a 30 seconds card or quick quiz on, whatever's just been spoken about. And often that's some of people's most enjoyable times in a conference. I wouldn't speak for myself there, but that's what I'm told.
One of the universities in Belgium, Vives, they have what I think is just a brilliant, it's almost like a library. It's called the Spielen Lab. And it's basically, it started as an archive of board games that they started in the 1970s. And they've just been collecting board games ever since. So when I visited them, they had well over 27,000 different board games. And how they actually mobilize that is by working with local businesses and saying, okay, so, in your team that you have at this point in time, what is the problem that you have?
Right.
And there will be some sort of a board game that covers that. If you need to talk about, negotiation, there are negotiation board games. If you need to talk about selling, there are selling board games. There's so many things that have been explored in the game space. And that is what we call game-based learning. So instead of designing a new game around, the thing you're trying to solve, you use one of the games that already exist.
Analog for that problem.
As an analog for that problem. So I think there's just so many games at this point in time. Some of them, may not be a great use of your time. There are a lot of games that are incredibly great, things for just spending your time on. So I think, from the negative perspective, people spending too much time playing games is probably a bad thing. But that's true of basically every that's this point in time. So I don't think that's necessarily, a bad thing about games specifically.
Right.
But
I'll ask you one last question. Two last questions. I'm going to sneak another one in. Anything I should have asked you about today that you're just so passionate about that everyone should be looking at, that you feel we're all missing from what you're seeing in your work? You mentioned AI briefly. I mean, that's a whole nother topic, but what else should we look at? And then I'm also going to ask, tell me your top 3 games: one card game, one board game, one video game.
Wow, that's a hard question.
I know.
So I do think at this point in time, I mean, there's a lot of, things going around where they say, AI is going to take people's jobs. I don't think it's necessarily the case that AI and automation is going to take people's jobs. I think those people that know how to leverage AI in their job are going to take the jobs of the people that don't know. I think AI is it's an enabling technology, and knowing how to use it, well, obviously responsibly, because I think that's also something that people sometimes miss. But knowing how to use it responsibly to its best,
so responsible optimization.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So that is definitely something that.
And you think that is a trend coming through?
It is a trend coming through. I feel like not as much as it should be.
Okay.
Because some of our local companies are not necessarily picking it up as quickly as they should be. And on the international scale, I mean, there's absolutely organizations that are running. And I think understanding how it impacts your business and how it can, impact your business in a positive way or a negative way, if you need to pivot in any way, I definitely think that is something that people need to be looking at. So that would be my main thing at this point.
Negative gold.
Yeah, absolutely.
And now let me press you on your favorite games.
Yeah. So I would say if I look at what I play the most at the moment, it's actually tabletop role playing. So I play with Russell Goldman, who teaches creative writing at UNISA. So he's my game master. It has been for many, many years.
Sure.
He's one of the best storytellers that I've ever come across, and that is something I find really, really fulfilling. Is getting together once a week. We do it online. So there's an opportunity to sort of talk with friends, but then really solving puzzles and going through an experience. I mean, we've had games run multiple years.
Wow.
That probably
D&D, or is it different?
So we've done some D&D, okay. But my favorite setting is Legend of the Five Rings. It's a brilliant setting. We also did Call of Cthulhu for about 3 years, which was also a brilliant one. We're currently playing a system called Ars Magica, which is also really, really great.
And for someone not into tabletop or RPG,
so I think. So this one is a card and a video game. It's a game called Balatro. So it's effectively, if you would imagine gamifying poker, that's basically the concept. So you just need your understanding of the different poker hands, but by playing the game, you're constantly modifying your deck and you've got a number of jokers that influence your deck in different ways.
Sure.
And then you see how high of a score you can attain. And that's quite a fulfilling game, I must admit. Then in terms of actual computer games, okay, the lottery is a computer game, but noble computer games. I would say Red Dead Redemption 2 and Witcher 3 were probably two of the games that I really did.
So the RPG storytelling coming through all of your answers
today. Yeah, absolutely. I do. I mean, it is there's a quote by Terry Pratchett. I'm probably going to butcher it, but he said, anthropologists have got it wrong. We're not Homo sapiens, which means wise man. We're actually the storytelling chimpanzee, Pans Narans, and I've always thought that's a really great way of describing people. We do experience things through stories. And I've also, I think if I was to do something different in my PhD to what I did, I would probably add more of a story element to it. And I think generative AI actually makes that a lot easier now than what it's ever been. So, yeah.
Amazing insight. Thank you, Japie. Thanks for joining us on the pod. If anyone wants to get in touch with you, reach out to you, how could they do that?
So it's Greeff, GREEFF.J for Japie, at belgiumcampus.ac.za. It's also on the Belgium campus website. So
thanks so much for your time. It's been a real pleasure and a privilege.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Benjamin. This was great.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Shapers, Makers, Builders and Breakers. We trust that you've been encouraged by what you've just heard. Subscribe to future episodes and find out more about us at shaperspodcast.co.za. That is shaperspodcast.co.za.
Well, that's right. Don't forget to subscribe for new episodes and other content. And remember, share any feedback with us. We'd love to hear from you. Find me on Twitter at b_d_shaw or via email. We look forward to your company the next time on Shapers, Makers, Builders and Breakers. Until that time, cheers, bye-bye.